This is the Creative Market Free Goods Roundup for the week of September 21st, 2015. There are 6 different free goods this week, but they are free this week only. So if you see something you like when you're watching this video, just check out the description of this video where I'll place links to each one of these 6 different free items. So first up here is Blog Portfolio CMS Penguin. So this is a fully responsive portfolio theme using the Kirby CMS, and I'm actually not familiar at all with the Kirby CMS, so I can't really talk about it a whole lot. But I did notice that you do have to pay for a license to use the Kirby CMS. So before you go in here and use that, or if you download this and start customizing it, you might want to look into that first and just make sure it's something that you're willing to pay for. But let's get into the actual theme itself. So on the front page right here is the portfolio where we have a few different items where if you click on any one of these different things, it'll bring you to that particular page or particular item. So I went ahead and clicked on one of those links which brought me to this page. So the overall nature of this theme is extremely simplistic and it should be pretty easy to go in here and customize it because of that. So I'll click on the Where tab right here, which will bring up a bunch of different products from Creative Market in this case. So if you wanted to show off a personal store and have them all link off, this might be a way of doing that. And as I scroll down right here, you can kind of see how these items pop up and load in as I scroll down through them. And I'll just click on the Who section, which is kind of an About Us or About Me, depending on how you want to use this particular page. So right here it says since, and then it says person's age. Within About Me, plenty of room for a description about yourself or your business below that. There's a little sidebar section right here. You can kind of call it important dates or other information as you see fit. And on the right side right here, we have an email me and then a few different social networking links. If I go down all the way to the bottom, there's a very simple footer right here. So overall, this is a very simplistically laid out site that should be very quick for you to go in here and use. Just be mindful that it is using the Kirby CMS. That is a paid platform. So even though you might download this theme for free, to actually use it online, at least outside of the trial period, you will have to buy into that CMS. So that is something to kind of factor in when you're considering using this. But if you're looking for a nice and simple portfolio theme, this might be one worth checking out. So if you like what you've seen thus far and you think you might have some use for this, just be sure to pick it up this week while it's still free. Next up is Halftone Textures Volume 1. This download includes 8 different halftone textures in Photoshop format, and these are exceptionally large. If I go to image and then image size, these are 5400 by 7200 pixels. So they should be plenty big for pretty much anything you use them on the web or a lot of different print applications as well. If I quickly convert this to inches, it's 18 by 24 inches at 300 pixels per inch. So that's big enough for like t-shirt designs or poster designs, anything like that. So these are sized quite appropriately for what you'll probably use them for. So like I said before, there are 8 of them in total, and they do have backgrounds. If I turn that off, you can tell these are transparent, so they should be very easy to apply to your work. Now I'm just going to zoom in really close on some of these so you can get a better idea of how these halftones look up close. There is a nice diversity in the amount of density of the dots here. It's a little bit harder to see when you're really close, but as you start to zoom out a little bit more, you can start to see some of the larger patterns as a whole. And when I start using patterns like this personally, I tend to like using them very large. When they're really small like this, it's a little bit harder to tell that there's a halftone dot pattern going on. It's more of a rough texture overlay that's a bit more consistent with the typical grunge, but as the pattern becomes a bit larger like this, you can really tell that it's a halftone dot pattern. So that's why I tend to like using these a little bit larger rather than zoomed out all the way right here, although this does make for an interesting gradiated textured background. And as you can tell with this one right here, these do look quite a bit different from one another. Some of them are a bit more similar than others, but there are some pretty cool patterns inside these. Like there's some linear, almost scratch marks going on at the bottom here, with the center section being much more heavily textured. So feel free to pick which texture you think will work best on your projects as a whole, where a texture like this one is much lighter with really nice light sections in the middle here. So ones like this are nice if you're trying to do something a little bit lighter that won't completely overpower or overtake your work. And like I said before, when you're zoomed in a little bit closer like this right here, you can really start to see the cool patterns that these halftones make, and that's why I tend to like working a little bit larger like I said before. So here's another one with a lot of linear scratch patterns. It sort of reminds me if you're using a well-worn or kind of dirty screen printing screen. So if you're looking for some textures like that as well, they can also be found inside this pack. This one's a pretty interesting texture and one of my favorites of this particular bunch. So on this one, as you can see right here is the main texture pattern, but I also threw my logo in here and then applied the texture to it. So I'll just turn this off and then turn on my logo so I can zoom in a little bit closer. So this is a general idea of what you can expect when you apply these textures to your own work. So either logos or different designs or even as a background, it's kind of up to you how you want to use those. But I did increase the size of the texture quite a bit it to make it look like this. Alternatively, if your item was really small and you apply the full super huge texture to it, it would also look like this when you're zoomed into 100%. But this way you can really get a good sense of the halftone pattern and the sort of distinct visual nature that they have. So I think this effect turned out pretty cool. And I'm gonna go through these last ones pretty quick here. So this one is a nice and light texture. So if you're looking for something that's a little bit more subtle, this one is a pretty good one to pick. And if I zoom in really close on these halftone dots right here, you can get a pretty good sense of how these look. They're nice and spaced out without being too large, so a nice and subtle effect here. And this is the 8th one, which is the last one, which has a lot of these scratch patterns as well as some kind of variations in the overall lightness and darkness. There's some streaks on the left hand side here that look kind of interesting as I zoom in a little bit closer. So overall, this is a pretty cool pack of 8 different very high resolution halftone dot textures inside Photoshop. So I think ideally these are going to be really good for stuff like poster design or t-shirt design, as halftones are a little bit more friendly to the screen printing process. It might take some trial and error depending on the printer themselves and what dot patterns they need for their screens to work best, but this is a pretty good starting point if you're trying to replicate that hand printed, screen printed look. So that's it for this pack. If you liked what you saw and you want to get some use out of this, just be sure to pick it up this week. Next up is 34 vintage rubber stamps. This is actually a really cool idea for a pack, and the format for this, by the way, is Photoshop, so you are going to need Photoshop to use this, but it's just stamps, a bunch of different stamps that you could apply to your work, and they all have a transparent background as well, so they should be very easy to apply to your work or layer upon each other, all that fun stuff if you want to go ahead and do that. So I'm going to go through this one pretty quick right here, since I think it is somewhat self-explanatory of what to expect. But there is a nice and diverse selection of different stamp elements here to go and use. So if you're looking to give your work a very vintage or perhaps even industrial vibe, I think these will come in super handy. And I'll zoom in a little bit closer, which is actually past 100%. This is at 200%, so these might look a little bit blurry. But just to show the really cool texture inside these stamps that you can come to expect, which includes both elements of transparency and then different knocked out elements where the stamp didn't fully transfer all the ink on it that give it a much more authentic look. So that's it for this pack, but like I said before, I think this one's really cool and all these look extremely nice. I think these have a lot of style to it, and since they all look like they're part of the same stamp family, they should work very nicely across a series of projects where you want to use these different stamps but have them all kind of tie into each other and visually look very similar. So that's it for this pack. If you think you'll have use for it, just be sure to grab it this week. Next up is Resume Template, the Whitney. This is a resume template provided in both Photoshop as well as Word formats. Since I don't have Word installed on this computer, I'm opening up in Photoshop here to show it. And it includes a cover letter as well as a 2-page resume. So shown right here is the cover letter, and then here are the resume page 1, and this is the page 2. So I'll start with the cover letter first. So overall, this is a very cleanly laid out and quite professional looking resume template. And I should also note that it's 8.5 by 11, which is inside the guidelines right here. And outside of that is just room for bleed. So if you want to do full color printing to the edges, that is something you can easily do with at least the Photoshop version right here. And as you can tell, each section in the layers is nicely laid out. So the header is in its own folder as well as the main content and then the footer. So it's easy to figure out where everything lives inside these nicely organized folders. And all the type is live and fully customizable. So you can of course customize this to be all about you, which makes sense for something like a resume template. So as you can tell right here, this is just nice and clean as far as the way it looks. It's very easy to figure out what information is presented and where. So I think this is a pretty darn good template to at least start with if you're looking to craft your own cover letter and resume. This is all pretty self-explanatory. Up the top is your name. All the content is in the middle, with at the very bottom here a phone, email, as well as a LinkedIn address. You could of course remove the LinkedIn if you don't have one or replace it with a Twitter or Facebook, whatever the case may be. And this signature right here is actually a font as well, so you can go ahead and customize the signature to your own. So here is page 1 of a resume, and in general I tend to send 1-page resumes, not 2-page resumes, although a lot of people do send multiple-page resumes, so it is nice that they do include that option. And as you can see, it is a basic 2-column layout with the left-hand side a spot for your picture where this gray circle is, and below that you can describe yourself as well as list your expertise. Below that we have a tech skills, so you can kind of list out what you think you're best at, and below that we have the education. On the right side is the work experience with the contact information once again at the very bottom here. And the second page right here is a work experience continued. So if you're a person person that has a lot of work experience and you want to include everything and make it a 2-page or even more resume, you can of course use the second page to keep on doing that. If you want to include even more than what's shown right here, you could perhaps hide the achievements and references and then just duplicate these layers right here to add even more work experience. But below the work experience, as I said before, we have achievements. So if you have some awards behind your belt or some really special accomplishments, you might want to list them here, as well as references if you want to go ahead and include those. And once again, at the bottom here, we have the contact information for yourself. I think it's a nice idea to include your contact information on every page. In case they lose a page or want to just quickly reference it, it's nice to have it on everything, so it's very hard to miss. So that's it for this pack. Overall, a very nice and clean layout, and I think this one is a very professional looking one as well. It uses color, but not too much. It's not too over the top. So if you're applying to a little bit more traditional company that doesn't want something that's a little bit too loud or too busy, I think this is a really nice spot to be as far as trying to get some style in there without doing a bit too much. So if you're on the hunt for a new job or just looking to update your cover letter and resume, this one might be super handy for you. So if you think you'll have use for this, just be sure to download it this week while it's still free. Next up is Printers Pack with 8 bonus textures. This is a collection of textures provided in Illustrator format, and there are also some bonus textures shown right here, and these are provided in both Photoshop as well as Illustrator format. So if you want some Photoshop textures, these ones are here to be used as well. But I'm going to start with the main pack of textures right here. So they're all inside the layers, so make sure you have your layers palette opened, which is under Window, and then layers sort of near the middle, and then you can just turn on and off the different layers to see all the different options of textures here. And it looks like by the style presented is that all these textures were created with an ink roller or brayer. So there's some interesting textures created by doing that. Some of them, like this one, are extremely dense, with a few of them being a little bit lighter. And I'll just zoom in a little bit closer on this texture so you can kind of get an idea of how this looks. So for the most part, most of these have a very dense center. With the edges where the roller was going on, you can kind of see the different strokes of the roller here. You can get some different varied patterns out of that. And I should note too, when you're dealing with vector textures like this that are very complex, you might experience a little bit of slowdown on your machine. So you might want to find the perfect texture for you to use inside this pack and then bring that texture into its own new window of its own document and close the other one. So it's only dealing with rendering that one particular texture. And here we have a few different more singular rolled textures. So I'll go zoom in a little bit closer here so you can get a good idea of the overall look of these. I think a lot of these textures look very nice applied to the background or as a background element on a page instead of being knocked out of a foreground element, because they are so dense in their texture that if you were to knock this out of, like, let's say you had a logo and you knock this guy out of it, you'd pretty much knock out the entire logo. Although an alternative way of doing it is you could bring one of these into something like Photoshop and then inverse it, and in return you would have a much lighter texture. For example, if you were to imagine the white sections of this rolled ink texture right here as being dark by bringing this into Photoshop and then inverting it, you would have a much more sparsely populated texture to apply over your work. And I'll just zoom out here and go over the last few textures that are in this one. So there is really quite a few different textures inside this pack with a few different looks, as you're seeing right here. These don't all look the same. There are quite a few different overall textures that are probably by using different types of papers and different amounts of ink on the actual rollers themselves. That way you can get some pretty interesting variations in these textures. And also included are some much lighter textures like this one right here that I personally find to be the most useful, ones that are a bit more sparse that just add a little bit of flavor to your texture, and then ones like this that are much more hard or harsh. Like I said before, you can feel free to invert these inside a program like Photoshop if you want to go ahead and do that to make them a little bit different and have a little bit different characteristic. So here are the last few textures inside this one. This is a very nice subtle texture right here, and then this one being a very subtle texture and the final one of the main pack. And then these bonus textures are provided in both Photoshop as well as Illustrator format, and inside the Photoshop document they are vector smart objects, so they should be pretty much infinitely scalable just like any other vector object since they are included in that format. Many of these are much more sparsely populated or less dense than the ones in the main pack, so if you're looking for something a little bit lighter or less impactful, these bonus textures might be a bit more useful for you on that front. And here are the final couple that I'm showing right here. And of course all these ones in Illustrator you can feel free to copy and then paste them inside Photoshop if you want to have a texture inside there. They will still be vector essentially since it'll be a vector smart object, so you can scale them as big or as small as you want and you'll never lose quality, which makes these super duper useful for really large projects. But that's it for this pack. If you're on the hunt for some textures, then this one's definitely worth picking up. Just be sure to do it this week while it's still free. And last up is Beers, Glasses, and Logos Volume 2. So this pack is pretty self-explanatory. It's all about beer, and the file format itself is EPS, so I have it opened up inside Illustrator here to show it. Up at the top here we have a bunch of different beer glasses and mugs and steins, all that fun stuff. On the left side they are filled up with beer, where on the right side they are empty, so you could fill them up with their own thing or leave them empty if you want to. Perhaps you could use these on a menu at your local pub or brewery. They should be very useful for something like that, and you can of course select one of these different colored elements in here and change it to be a different color if that's something you want to do. So they are very customizable in that aspect. And I'll go down here, which are actually my favorite parts of this particular pack, which are all these different icons. So things like hops and barley, all those things that are more related to the brewing industry are in here, as well as some different stuff that might not typically be associated with it, like this church right here or this goat icon. And below that we have some very nice kind of pre-made logo or badges that you could go in and customize. So if you want to remove this type that says beer, you can just ungroup this and then select that element. Well, in this case it might take a little bit more work, but you can go in there and remove these individual elements and replace it with your own logo or type as you see fit. And the same thing applies to these two right here. They're just very clean and simple design that seem to go pretty well with the style of a lot of new breweries that are popping up all over the US and probably all around the world. And below that we have a few different labels that just say beer, and of course you can go in here and customize the type as you see fit. So I think this pack as a whole is super useful for creating something like a menu or a website focused around brewing or beer, as all these elements could be used. All these icons and different beer glasses, etc., should come in pretty handy for that purpose. But I think that should give you a pretty good idea of what to expect in this pack. So if you think you'll have use for this one, just be sure to grab it this week. So that's it for this week's free goods, and do remember they are free this week only. So if you want to pick anything up, just check out the description of this video where you will find a link to do so. And as always, if you found this video helpful, please like and favorite. And if you want to see this video every week, please subscribe. This video is released every Monday to know it's free this week on Creative Market. Thank you for watching.